Data Science Rabbit podcast with Michael Bagelman.
Our dear listeners, welcome back to the Data Science Rabbit podcast, where once again, I, Cornelius P. Snarkington, am filling in for Michael Bagelman as we continue our eerie tour of Halloween-themed episodes. Today, we turn our attention to a paper from 2006, Cinema Fiction versus Physics Reality, penned by two physicists no less, who make the bold and misguided attempt to dissuade us from the existence of the undead. Truly, a fool's errand. Let us begin with their first ill-conceived notion, the supposed debunking of ghosts. The authors posit that many a haunted house is simply drafty, and because drafts make us feel cold, they reason that reports of sudden chills in the presence of ghosts can be dismissed as mere atmospheric shifts. Ah, yes, because clearly a bit of cool air entirely negates the existence of the supernatural. It's as if they've never considered that there could be more than one explanation for a cold sensation. After all, we don't deny the existence of icebergs simply because drafts exist. A non sequitur, if ever there was one. The physicists then proceed to point out a supposed contradiction. Ghosts, they claim, are immaterial, and yet ghostly footsteps are often heard in haunted houses, especially those creaky late-night trips up and down the stairs. They find it baffling that something without physical form could produce such sounds. But once again, their limited understanding of the supernatural shows through. Had they ever mixed cornstarch and water to create oobleck, a non-Newtonian fluid, they might understand that some materials, physical or otherwise, can behave very differently under different conditions. Clearly they are ignorant of the complex properties of ectoplasm. A shame, really, as it's Ghost Science 101. Then comes their pièce de résistance, a Malthusian argument against vampires. According to their simple mathematical models, vampires, left unchecked, would swiftly extinguish all of humanity. And because we humans are in fact still here, they conclude that vampires cannot possibly exist. How quaint! Rather than question their simplistic assumptions, they choose to deny the existence of one of the most cunning and intelligent of the undead. Vampires, of course, are not mindless wolves that would foolishly consume every last human and leave themselves without a food source. They are far more strategic. Moreover, their numbers are kept in check by the tireless work of vampire hunters and their ongoing war with werewolves, a conflict thoroughly documented in multiple films. To overlook this shows a startling lack of attention to cinematic evidence. And lastly, the physicists attempt to dismiss the existence of zombies by pointing to cases of people exposed to tetrodotoxin derived from pufferfish and surviving only to appear zombified. How convenient. But this explanation, however intriguing, fails to address why so many people would have been snacking on pufferfish in the first place, nor does it account for the far more common form of zombification, the bite of another zombie. Surely they could have spent more time studying classic zombie lore and less time with their exotic fish theories. In conclusion, dear listeners, as Halloween draws near, I for one will remain well armed with garlic, silver bullets, holy water, and every other form of protection one might need. As for those of you who place your faith in the pseudo-scientific quackery of physicists, well, good luck to you. You'll need it. And now, for those who dare to continue, sit back and enjoy the delightful banter of the deep dive team from Notebook LM as they review this rather questionable paper in more detail.
All right, get ready because today we're going deep into some spooky stuff. Listener favorites, really, the strange, the supernatural, but with a scientific twist. You guys have sent in a ton of research, articles, even some ghost hunting clips. Looks like you've been busy.
It never gets old, does it? These myths, these legends, they really tap into something, don't they? Like a fear of the unknown, maybe.
Yeah.
Or just that curiosity about what's beyond our everyday reality.
Totally. And who doesn't love a good ghost story, especially this time of year, right? But speaking of ghosts, one of the most common things you hear is that sudden chill, right? Like it's a sign of a ghost, like that haunted gallery at Hampton Court Palace. People say it gets freezing when Catherine Howard's ghost is around.
Hampton Court, yeah. It really shows you how much what we expect can change how we see things. Although those chills people feel, those cold spots, might have a simpler explanation. It might be more about physics than phantoms.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does science explain a ghost then?
Well, it's all about how heat moves around. Heat transfer. There are three main ways it happens: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction, that's when heat moves through direct contact, like when you touch something hot like a stove.
Makes sense so far.
Right, then there's convection, heat moving through a fluid like air or water. Think about how a radiator warms up a room. And lastly, radiation. That's how the sun's warmth reaches us.
Got it. So how does this all tie back to Hampton Court then? And these ghostly chills?
Imagine this huge old palace like Hampton Court. Lots of drafts, right? You've got convection currents, which are basically invisible rivers of air swirling all around. And the building itself, how it's built, the open windows, even things like hidden doorways that researchers have found, they all affect those drafts.
So it's not a ghost, it's just bad circulation.
Pretty much. Our brains are just wired to find patterns. We hear these ghost stories, we're in the spooky old place, and suddenly a random draft feels like the icy breath of a queen who met an untimely end.
It's amazing how a little breeze can become a ghost story, right?
Absolutely. Our minds are powerful things.
Okay, but here's where the whole ghost thing gets really weird for me. Ghosts are immaterial, right? They can walk through walls or whatever, but then in movies, they can walk upstairs, slam doors. Like it always works out for the plot. Like in Ghost with Patrick Swayze. How's he managing those stairs if he's a ghost?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it shows you just how many contradictions there are in how we think about ghosts. Because even walking, for us clumsy humans, it means interacting with, like, the physical world.
Right. You can't walk on air as much as we'd like to sometimes.
Exactly. Think about Newton's laws of motion. Every step we take, we're pushing against the ground. Action, reaction. So if a ghost can walk, that means it can exert force. Which means it's not exactly immaterial, is it?
It makes you wonder if they've figured out how to break the laws of physics in other ways. Why even bother with walking? Why not just float around or something less, I don't know, human?
Right. You'd think they'd have more creative ways of getting around.
Speaking of spooky things that might not quite add up, let's talk about vampires. I'm getting some serious Blade vibes from all this research you sent over.
Yes, the classic blood-sucking monster. There's so much to unpack with vampire lore, but that need to feed on human blood and often turn those victims into vampires themselves, that's pretty consistent.
Yeah, but it makes you wonder if vampires need to feed as often as, say, Dracula would have us believe. Wouldn't that cause some problems? Like population-wise, wouldn't we be a little low on humans by now?
That's where things get really interesting. Okay, let's just play with a hypothetical scenario. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that a vampire only needs to feed once a month, which, based on most vampire movies, is probably a low estimate. And let's go back in time a bit. The year 1600, let's say. Back then, there were, roughly 536,870,911 humans on Earth.
Okay, so we've got our starting population and one very polite vampire who only feeds once a month. What happens next?
Well, every time our vampire feeds, right, we lose a human but gain another vampire. So after a month, 2 vampires, then 4. Then 8.
Oh, right. Exponential growth. I see where you're going with this.
Exactly. And it gets scary fast when you're dealing with a predator that has basically a 100% conversion rate. The human population, that might double every few decades. But the vampires, they'd be doubling every single month.
So, how long before humans go extinct in this scenario?
Let's see. According to my calculations, humanity would be wiped out by June of 1602.
2 years. Wow, that's not a bloodbath. That's a blood puddle. Okay, so maybe vampires wouldn't quite work out in reality. But what about zombies? They're having a real moment lately,
They really are. And while we tend to think of zombies these days as, like, reanimated corpses hungry for brains, the actual zombie myth, it goes way deeper than that.
Right. It's not all Dawn of the Dead. You found some really interesting stuff on the voodoo zombie myth. There was that case in Haiti, right? With Wilfred Dorison.
Yeah. That case is really something else, and it might give us some clues into where that whole zombie myth comes from. Because this young man, Wilfred Dorson, he supposedly died, was buried, and then, well, he came back. At least that's how it seemed. But he was different.
That must have been terrifying for everyone. What did people think happened?
That's where things get really interesting. To understand this, we have to talk about something called tetrodotoxin, or TTX.
TTX, wait, is that what they have to be so careful with when they're preparing fugu?
You got it. Fugu, that pufferfish delicacy,
Yeah.
it's super regulated because of TTX. Because in high enough doses, it's deadly. But here's the thing. In lower doses, it can cause this kind of paralysis that looks like death. Your heart slows down, your breathing is really shallow, it can even look like rigor mortis is setting in.
Wait, so you're telling me someone could be exposed to this toxin, they could seem dead, but they're actually not?
That's the scary part. And what's even more unsettling is that sometimes the brain can still be aware through all of it.
Oh, that's just horrifying. To be buried alive, completely paralyzed, completely unable to tell anyone what's happening.
It's the stuff of nightmares.
Mm.
And while we can't know for sure what happened to Wilfred Dorrison, there were reports that he was given a potion before he seemed to die.
Yeah.
And if that potion had TTX in it,
It could explain why everyone thought he was dead and why they buried him. But he didn't die, right? So he must have had a non-lethal dose, so then what? They dig him up.
exactly. And this is where things get really strange. Because after some time, Dorrison was found near his village, wandering around, unable to speak, and he wasn't himself.
Yeah.
He had no personality. He was basically a real-life zombie.
So you're saying this TTX poisoning plus the trauma of being buried alive could have caused brain damage? Is that how they explained what happened to him?
Some researchers think it's a real possibility. The lack of oxygen, while he was buried,
Right.
plus the potential neurological effects of the TTX. Maybe it triggered some kind of amnesia or caused motor function problems. All those things that we think of as classic zombie traits.
That's incredible. So the zombie myth, at least in this case, it might come from something real. But what about that whole controlled by a voodoo priest thing? Was there any truth to that?
That's where things get a little fuzzy. We don't have any scientific proof that TTX could be used for mind control. But thinking about Haitian culture, where voodoo is a huge part of life, it's easy to see how those beliefs would get mixed up with the very real, very terrifying effects of TTX poisoning.
Wow. So a toxic mix of science and superstition. Fascinating stuff. It makes you think, the whole thing about TTX, just because we figure out something scientifically possible, it doesn't exactly make it ethical.
You're right. There's a lot of potential for abuse with something like TTX.
Right. Imagine if someone used this knowledge to exploit people, to create their own zombies. Pretty disturbing stuff. On that note, maybe we should move on from the undead and talk about something a little less, existentially terrifying. We've covered ghosts and zombies, so that leaves vampires. And, we got so caught up in the population dynamics of it all, we didn't even get into the other classic vampire things, like that whole aversion to sunlight thing.
Right, that one. The classic vampires bursting into flames trope. Always good for a dramatic scene. And believe it or not, even though there's no proof of, spontaneous combustion, there are real conditions that can make people sensitive to sunlight.
Really? What could cause that?
So there's this group of genetic disorders called porphyria.
Porphyria? I've never heard of that.
Yeah. It's not exactly common knowledge, but basically it messes with how your body makes heme.
Remind me what that is again.
It's part of hemoglobin.
The hemoglobin, right, the protein in our blood that carries oxygen.
Exactly. And one of the more serious types of porphyria, erythropoietic protoporphyria, try saying that 3 times fast.
Erythropoietic protoporphyria.
Right. So people with that one, or EPP for short, it can cause really bad skin problems like lesions and blistering if they're out in the sun.
Ouch. So someone with a bad case of this EPP goes out in the sun and
it's not going to be pretty. They won't burst into flames or anything, thankfully, but it can be super painful, and the damage to their skin can be bad. So it's not that crazy to think that back in the day, people saw this kind of thing, and, they came up with stories about creatures of the night.
Wow, so we might have a real-life medical condition to thank for vampire lore. I'm convinced sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction.
It really is, and it's amazing to see how much our understanding of the world and the stories we tell, how they all influence each other.
It's like our ancestors were trying to understand things they didn't have explanations for. And sometimes those explanations, they became myths and legends. So we've covered ghostly chills, the terrifying possibilities of TTX, even a medical condition that might explain why vampires hate the sun. But there's still one big question we haven't really addressed.
Oh, and what's that?
How do we even define a ghost? I mean, they can't interact with the physical world, but they can walk upstairs. It's like, we need to look beyond what we know, beyond classical physics even, for a real explanation. I mean, I've always thought of ghosts as ethereal, not really of this world,
Right, that whole ethereal, intangible thing.
Yeah.
But then how do they interact with the physical world, right?
Yeah.
Walking around, slamming doors.
Yeah.
How do they do that if they're not bound by the same rules we are?
It's a real head scratcher. You mentioned looking beyond classical physics earlier. Are we going quantum here?
We might have to, because there's this thing in quantum mechanics. It's called the observer effect.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that. It's about how, light can be a wave or a particle, depending on if it's being observed, right?
You got it. It's one of those things in quantum mechanics that just seems impossible. Just the act of observing something, a human consciousness, being aware of the system, it can actually change how particles behave at the quantum level.
So what you're saying is our minds, our awareness, it can have a real measurable effect on, reality.
In a way, yeah. It gets really complicated really fast, but some researchers have actually suggested that what we think of as ghosts could be, a manifestation of this observer effect.
Hold on, I need to catch up here. So you're saying ghosts could be quantum observers, and it's our consciousness that's causing them to materialize, basically.
It's a pretty wild idea, right?
Yeah.
What if those chills, those feelings that something's off, what if it's not a ghost, but actually our own consciousness interacting with, the quantum realm and causing these disturbances in reality?
Okay, my mind is officially blown. From spooky chills to voodoo toxins to quantum ghosts, tonight's deep dive is really living up to its name.
And that's what I love about approaching these myths with a scientific perspective. It's not about proving them wrong, but about seeing where imagination and the natural world, where they intersect.
Totally. It's about being open to the mystery of it all, but also seeing how science can give us a new way of looking at things.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe someday we'll have a better understanding of how the universe works, and we'll be able to finally figure out what's really going on with all this seemingly supernatural stuff.
Well, until then, I guess we'll keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep the spooky stories coming. So where do we go from here? We've got these ghostly chills, this voodoo toxin that can create a sort of zombie state, even a medical condition that could explain the whole vampire hates the sun thing. But we haven't really figured out what a ghost is, have we?
It's a tricky one. It's like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Mm-hmm.
Can't interact with the physical world,
Mm.
but they can walk upstairs. Something's not adding up.
Exactly. So how do we make sense of it all? Do we need to, rewrite the laws of physics?
Maybe we need to look at those laws a little differently. Remember that observer effect we were talking about?
Yeah.
The one from quantum mechanics?
Oh, yeah. The one where just observing something can change it. It's like our minds influencing reality.
Right. Some researchers think this could play a role in how we experience ghosts.
Wait, really? How so?
Imagine this. Those cold spots, those feelings of unease. What if it's not a ghost itself, but our own consciousness interacting with something unknown? And that interaction, it creates these disturbances, these blips in reality.
Okay, hold on. That's a lot to unpack. Are you saying that ghosts could be side effects of our minds trying to understand something beyond our current understanding?
It's a fascinating possibility, right? What if ghosts aren't about haunting, but about the limits of our own perception?
That is mind-blowing. So we've gone from spooky chills to voodoo toxins to quantum ghosts. I'm starting to think the truth really is stranger than fiction.
And that's the beauty of science, isn't it? It's not about dismissing the mysteries, but exploring them. Who knows what we'll discover next?
That's a good point. It's about staying curious and never being afraid to dig deeper, even if the answers lead to more questions.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've just about reached the end of our deep dive for today.
But the conversation doesn't have to end here. To all our listeners, keep those theories coming, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the unexplained.
This has been the Data Science Rabbit Podcast, hosted by Michael Bagelman. Find the Data Science Rabbit Podcast on all your favorite social media, including YouTube and TikTok. Follow Michael on LinkedIn or visit datasciencerabbithole.com.